5.5 liter flat plane crank. Yes! Well, that's what everybody is telling you that the next Z06 engine is going to be. You've probably read it in Car and Driver and Motor Trend, and you've been arguing about it online for the last couple days. I'm here to tell you that I don't think that is necessarily the next Z06 engine, and I'm going to explain exactly why. Hi, my name is Eric, and we're going to talk about this engine, and I've also got a Discord chat, which is a real-time chat server. You can chat about cars all day long. It's absolutely free. It's linked down below. There's about 600 members. We've got multiple rooms. It's a really great community. Here's what Motor Trend says. Source: the C8 Corvette Z06 is getting a flat plane crank twin turbo V8! Exclamation! And a little bit farther down, we expect that the Z06, ZR1, and hybrid versions will use a 5.5 liter flat plane V8 in various states of tune, making between 600 and 1,000 horsepower. So we really don't know a whole lot about the ZR1. That's going to be a little bit farther down the line, probably 2 years away. The Z06, let's look into these rumors, see if they're credible or not, and see why I think this might not be the engine that you're thinking is going to be. Now, V8 engines are pretty cool. I just made a review on the Challenger RT Scat Pack wide body manual. It's up here in the car. Check it out. Really cool video. Really cool car, by the way, too. But back to the Corvette. I've been studying the IMSA racing rules for hours now, and I've got a pretty good familiarity with them. So if you remember, you probably know that the C7R, the race version of the C7 Corvette, has been competing in IMSA for several years. And they've got a 5.5 liter engine in that car. Now, it's not a flat plane crank engine, but the rules around IMSA have a lot to do with why I think what I think regarding the new flat plane crank engine, if it's going to happen or not. So the C7R, it competes in IMSA in the GTLM class. It's been doing that for several years right now. Some of the races in this are the most famous in the world. You've probably heard of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. There's also the 12 Hours of Sebring and other races. So those are the races that it competes in. And there's other cars that compete in this series too, such as the Ford GT-LM. And I took these photos a couple of weeks ago, in fact last week, just up at Laguna Seca. Super amazing looking car. The Ferrari 488 GTE and the Porsche 911 RSR. These are all manufacturers' cars. These are cars that are essentially sponsored by the factory, and they compete in this series. Now, to compete in these series, if you're a manufacturer, there are certain requirements that you have to meet. Namely, you need to make 300 cars that are, road legal, that you're selling these cars on the street. There's a price limit. I think it's about $500,000, something along those lines. But you need to be making 300 cars to compete in this series. So for 2019, the current GTLM rules state that the engine has to have a displacement of 5.5 liters or less. And so currently the C7R runs a 5.5 liter engine. However, it's not a flat plane crank. This engine was actually developed in the C6. So this engine that they're running right now, it is a traditional overhead valve design, and it is from the 6.2 liter ZR1 that was made available in the C6, and it is de-stroked, and the supercharger has been removed because turbocharging is not permitted with this 5.5 liter engine in this class. So the C7R, it's competed at 24 Hours of Le Mans, American Le Mans, and here Tony Milner in 2014 is doing a practice session at Daytona, and you can listen to how this engine sounds. It's a pretty big, beefy, kind of rumbly sound, probably something you're pretty used to if you've been driving a Corvette for a while. So what we got is Car and Driver claiming that the new engine for the Z06, which probably won't be out for about a year at least, they're claiming that it is going to be a 5.5 liter because it needs to comply with the IMSA LMGTE rules. So that's their conclusion on this, but I don't exactly agree with that. The article is called "What We Know About the Flat Plane Crank V8 That Will Power the C8 Corvette, Z06, ZR1, and Hybrid." The expected 5.5 liter engine will offer 600 to 1,000 horsepower and a Ferrari rivaling sound. That does sound pretty good, actually. So here's my theory. Remember that C8R video of the car racing at night? So do you hear those downshifts and you hear how fast they are? I'm fairly convinced that is from a flat plane crank engine. Okay, so let's just talk about for a second, why is a flat plane crank engine so cool, and why is it so interesting, and why does everybody love them? So the crankshaft is in the bottom of the engine, and the pistons are connected to the crankshaft. The part of the crankshaft that they are connected to are called the crank pins. I've got this diagram up on screen right now. The crank pins are in blue in this diagram right now, and so this is a cross plane crank, and I'll explain what that is in a second. But a cross plane crank is the kind of engine that is the LT1, the LS series, the Ford Coyote, like pretty much every modern American V8 except for one is a cross plane crank. So that one exception is the engine in the Ford Mustang GT350. It's called the Voodoo engine, and it is a flat plane crank. So why is it called flat plane crank? Well, it's because the crank pins are 180 degrees across from each other. So this is what the GT350 crankshaft looks like. It's 5.2 liters and it makes 526 horsepower at 8250 RPM. That's way higher than an LS or an LT engine revs out to. So here's why it's called flat plane crank. Here's the profile of the crankshaft. If you look at it end on, you can see it's vertical because all of the crank pins are in one plane. They're aligned 180 degrees across from each other, so they're all in one plane. So that's why it's called a flat plane crank. There's only one plane, and that plane is flat. Here's what it looks like when it's rotating. So what is the effect of the firing order from a flat plane crank engine? So you get an explosion on one bank and then the others. So it goes left, right, left, right, left, right. That's basically the firing order. In a cross plane crank, the firing order is different. So it gives it a very, very unique sound. And there's another benefit to a flat plane crankshaft, is that you don't need such big, heavy counterweights like you do with a cross plane crank. The engine is inherently a little bit more balanced because of the firing order. It does have some other deficiencies, and we're going to get to that in a second. There's always a compromise with different engine designs. But because it is lighter, you don't need such heavy counterweights. It's going to be able to rev more quickly, up and down. You can change RPMs much more quickly. So because this crankshaft doesn't need such big counterweights, it's able to rev much faster. You're able to rev up and down much faster, and you're able to rev to a higher RPM typically too, although that has more to do with the valve train than the crankshaft, but it's the ability to rev up and down quickly that makes the flat plane crank pretty unique. Here's another image of the flat plane crank on the GT350. You can see the counterweights are all in one plane. Because the exhaust pulses are on opposite sides of the engine, that makes for more efficient gas scavenging. When you combust the fuel, the exhaust is able to get out more efficiently because of this design. Now, most four-cylinder engines are actually flat plane crank. Here's an animation of a four-cylinder engine doing its thing. Now, one of the big downsides of a flat plane crank design is vibration, and that is one of the reasons why the Italian cars and the European cars like Ferrari and so forth tend to have smaller engines, is because when you get the engine up to a larger size, the vibration becomes more of an issue, and it's a little bit complicated, but that's basically one of the major downsides of a flat plane crank. So a cross plane crank engine, why is it called a cross plane crank? Well, as you can imagine, we've already looked at the flat plane crank, and we looked at it head on, and we got one plane. In a cross plane crank, like a Chevy V8, you've got a cross. And so what you've got is you've got crank pins that are aligned 90 degrees from each other, not 180 degrees. And this has an effect, of course, on the firing order. So for example, a firing order that might be typical in a cross plane crank might be right, left, left, right, left, right, right, left. Remember, the flat plane crank is left, right, left, right, left, right the whole time. Let's look at these two profiles side by side. This is from a Jalopnik article a couple years ago. So you can see on the right-hand side, the flat plane crank, it has the cylinders 1, 4, 5, 8 on one side and 2, 3, 6, 7 on the other side. So because the firing order is not left, right, you need to add some counterbalance weights on the crankshaft to take into account that you've got two sequential explosions on the same bank. and you need to balance that out. And so the effect of having these counterweights on the crankshaft is that it is heavier, and the engine is going to tend to rev up and rev down a little bit more slowly. So here's an animation of a cross-plane crank V8, and of course this unique firing order tends to give it that really distinctive rumble that we all know and love from a V8. If you want to know what an American Chevy flat plane crank V8 might sound like at lower RPMs, I found a guy on Bring a Trailer, and a couple years ago, or actually a couple months ago, he sold his car. It's a C6 Z06, and he took the LS7 out of it, de-stroked it down, put in a special crankshaft, and made it a flat plane crank. And let's listen to the sound. So it sounds kind of like a classic LS7, but as it gets a little bit farther away from the camera, you can hear it sounds a bit different. So there it sounds a lot more like a Ferrari V8. It's got a much more high-pitched kind of wail. It has a real distinctive sound. It revs a lot higher, obviously, and it sounds pretty different. So I'm sort of wondering if Chevy does come out with this 5.5 liter flat plane crank engine, if it's going to sound something like this maybe at lower RPMs and higher RPMs. We're going to have to wait. Back to the IMSA plots. So IMSA, the LMGT class, it restricts the engines to 5.5 liters or less if they're naturally aspirated. However, there's another rule which restricts the engines to 4 liters or less if they have forced induction. They call it turbocharging, but it could also be supercharging. So that is another rule, and that is how some other manufacturers like Ford with the GT qualify in the same class. So what engine does General Motors have in their arsenal that's around 4 liters that's a V8? Cadillac. 4.2 liter black wing engine. It's a classic cross-plane crank, but it's in that displacement range. So right now it's a 4.2 liter. It's got turbos in the V. It's called a hot V. It's got quad cam, so it's 32 valves, and it puts out in the mid 500 horsepower range. So it revs really, really high. So Car and Driver claims that this is going to be stroked up to 5.5 liters, and this is going to be the basis of the new engine in the Z06, but I think I disagree with that. So if Chevy wants to continue to race an IMSA LMGTE class, they can have either the 5.5 liter engine, which they currently have, and they could continue over. That's a possibility. However, I think there's also this 4 liter engine that can be supercharged or turbocharged. That could potentially be the next engine in the next Z06. Remember, the LMGTE rules do not allow for forced induction at the 5.5 liter level. Now, as for the future ZR1, that could definitely be a 5.5 liter supercharged, turbocharged. We don't really know. The rumors are 800 to 1,000 horsepower. There could be hybridization. There really isn't a lot of concrete evidence or information on this yet. So yeah, absolutely, future ZR1 engine could be a 5.5 liter flat plane crank with all the chargers on it, and that would be pretty exciting. However, I think there's a strong possibility that the Z06, which would be the next level of the Corvette, most likely coming in about a year or so, that could indeed have a 4 liter engine that is twin turbocharged. I don't see why not. So in all likelihood, I think we're looking at 2 possible engine designs here: the 4 liter supercharged, turbocharged, whatever it's going to be, charged engine, or naturally aspirated 5.5 liter flat plane crank engine. They both could be flat plane crank engines. Let me know down in the comments which you think is more likely to happen. Remember, we are in the age of fuel economy, emissions, carbon taxes, all that kind of stuff. These are global standards that every manufacturer has to adhere to. Let me know which engine you think is going to be in the Z06. My Patreons get early access to my videos. They've also got some other benefits as well too, and I definitely want to thank them. They're up here on screen right now. We've got Real 6, Furious Grummel, Marlboro Ferrari, Squirrel Pope, and a whole bunch of others. Thank you guys so much for helping to support the channel. There's a couple other videos up on screen right now here too, and if you like this channel, you like what I'm doing, please hit subscribe, hit like, it really helps the channel out. My name is Eric. I will see you in the next video.